YouTube, how's it going? The Goat House is back with my updated college football rankings just after a big week 11. Obviously, some big time games, big time upsets. LSU over Alabama, Minnesota over Penn State, among others. So, some things changed at the top here heading into week 12. I do this video every single week. I really don't agree with the AP poll or the college football playoff poll. We'll see what the college football playoff poll has for us this week, but never really agree with them. I think they kind of contradict themselves. So that's why I do my rankings here. Before we get started, we have a subscriber goal of 40K subscribers by 2020. Please help us out by subscribing. Full NFL content as well in the offseason. We got draft coverage, all kinds of action here at the Goat House. Please subscribe. Click that like button. Check us out on Twitter at GoatHouseNFL. Always tweeting about NFL drafts, college football, NFL in season. Check us out. There's a link in the description for that. For more content, there's a link in the description for our Patreon page. But to my rankings heading into week 12 here. Number 25, and it's pretty interesting with 25, who I have Texas A&M and Virginia Tech, Iowa, Oklahoma State. Those teams I just named are pretty much in the same boat for me. They're in the same spot. They have 3 losses, and trying to split them up, trying to determine based off their body of work, their resume, and they're pretty dead even. They're pretty dead even. I think, as you can see, I have Iowa just missing, and I believe Iowa's still easily in the AP poll. To me, I look at Iowa's resume, and they have good losses. They have very good losses. They lost to 3 good teams. The wins, there's really not a win that's appealing to me. So I think, and I said this before, I think the AP poll and maybe the college football playoff poll, they value losses a little too much. I think that's kind of their tiebreaker. Their tiebreaker is losses, and I'm just not seeing it for Iowa really. Oklahoma State, same thing. Virginia Tech, just beating a ranked Wake Forest team is recently probably the most impressive out of those teams. They put up a fight with Notre Dame too, but again, that's a loss. I don't really value losses that much. And it's kind of back and forth between all those same teams. Texas A&M, Virginia Tech, Iowa, Oklahoma State. They're in the same area there. And, the deciding factor for me is who I actually thought the best team was. And I think it's A&M. A game like A&M and Iowa, maybe in a bowl game, that would be great. I picked A&M. I think they're going to start heating up here. But that was an interesting one. I haven't really had a tiebreaker. Never really had a real problem deciding who should go where. And I've done this video every single week. And that was kind of the first one. Again, Virginia Tech just had an impressive win against Wake Forest, so they were strongly considered. And then you have the one-loss teams, Appalachian State, Louisiana Tech. I think people are valuing the South Carolina win for Appalachian State a little too much. It's a pretty good win, South Carolina. I think they're mainly looking at because South Carolina beat Georgia, but it's been a disappointing season for South Carolina. They just got beat up by Tennessee a couple weeks before this, so I don't think I'm valuing that win as much as everyone else. 24 is Kansas State, a team that I think should be ranked. They have 3 losses too, but they separate themselves from the other 3 loss teams with their body work, with their resume, and it's more than Oklahoma, but it's really, when it comes down to that alone, gets them over teams like A&M, Virginia Tech, Iowa, Oklahoma State. It's an impressive resume, tough loss to Texas. That was a good ball game. They put up a fight. It's a tough schedule they had too, so Kansas State, to me, should definitely still be ranked. Coming in, making a new appearance at 23, and just so we know here, A&M was not ranked last week, and Kansas State was at 15 for me last week. But a new team here is the Hoosiers Indiana. Only 2 losses on the season. Yeah, there isn't a bunch. There's really no great wins. Not the most appealing wins. It starts to build up over time. Playing in the Big Ten. There's a lot of Big Ten teams putting up fights this year. Some new ones coming up there. So they're not free wins, really. But the fact that they're staying consistent right now and they have 2 losses, they're not in that 3-loss conversation. They squeeze in there. They go from not ranked to 23 for me. And a team that was not ranked in the past rankings for me, but has been this year, is the Texas Longhorns. So they move up to 22 from not ranked. They beat Kansas State, who was a good team. I had them at 15. So with 3 losses, but some impressive ball games from them, impressive win over Kansas State. That moves them up to 22 right now. 21 is a very impressive Navy team. They've had a pretty good season, pretty good resume as well. Playing in that conference now, there's a lot of teams putting up a fight with them too, so it's going to be interesting down the stretch. And now they got Notre Dame this week, and that's a game they can win. So things are about to get pretty interesting with Navy, going forward. If they can somehow upset Notre Dame, They definitely will shoot up. We know they'll move ahead of a Notre Dame team if they beat them with who would have 3 losses. But Navy was at 25. Now they're at 21. At 20 is Boise State. They were at 22 last week. They move up 2 mainly because what's happening around them, mainly because teams are moving down. 1-loss team, obviously, Boise State. Tough game against Wyoming. It's not the easiest competition. Wish it was a little more comfortable, but they move up 2 because they continue to win, and other teams are falling here. 19 is SMU. They were 21. They dropped down to 21 last week after falling to Memphis. They actually had a tight game with ECU, who had a tight game with Cincinnati the week before. Again, we got a battle with some of those teams up there. And they move up a couple spots. Again, not really because what they did, but what other teams moving down. Cincinnati is going to stay right at 18. Nothing changing there, and same goes for Memphis. I guess I'm a little different than the other polls. I got Memphis over Cincinnati. Just a little better resume. You look at who they beat, mainly who they beat. Memphis gets the edge to me. The SMU win puts them over the top. recently. Again, I think Cincinnati is getting more of the value because of the loss. They lost to Ohio State, even though it was 42-0 game. I think they're looking too much into that. So they are undefeated in the conference. That is impressive, but just looking at the body of work, I'm a little more impressed with Memphis. They are 1 spot ahead of Cincinnati. They got a battle up there. Moving up from number 19 to 16, a good win against Iowa. The Illinois loss still hurts. Maybe not as bad because Illinois is actually starting to play pretty well right now. But it's a game that Wisconsin should never lose. So that one still hurts. I can't put them up as high as maybe other polls may have them because of that loss. But a good win against Iowa had them jump some teams. They jumped teams that didn't lose here, Cincinnati and Memphis. So felt good enough about them after that Iowa win to put them at 16. Moving up 1 spot is Notre Dame. They get a good win against Duke. It's nothing crazy, but a little more comfortable in the VTech win there. So they're up just 1 spot to number 15. And then number 14 is still Michigan. They had a tough schedule. They had that impressive win against Notre Dame recently, so that's kind of what's got them ahead of them and into the top 15. They are at 14. Auburn is remaining at 13. They will play Georgia this week. That should be a pretty darn good. That should be a darn good game there. And they remain at 13. So nothing really changing there for Auburn. Maybe a little too close in their most recent game against Ole Miss. Number 12 is the Florida Gators, a beat-up game against Vanderbilt. Not enough to move up, though, just because what's going on ahead of them. So all these teams staying the same, but now we got a team that's changed where they're ranked. They were number 5 for me. They were 4 in the college football playoff poll. Penn State moved down all the way to 11. That's what, when you're discussing these top teams here, 1 loss, that's what it'll do to you. So a good game against Minnesota. Minnesota's a good team, but obviously one they fell short on, and that drops them down with 1 loss to number 11 there. And number 10 is Oklahoma. They're remaining at 10. Had them at 10 last week. That loss to Kansas State's pretty rough. They don't really have any tremendous wins. There's some solid wins there. It is a good football team. We know it's a good football team. They need a little more on the resume, and they can do that this week against Baylor, who I have at number 9, remains at number 9. A little bit of a scare against TCU. There was many times in that game where I felt TCU was winning that game. Baylor continues to come up clutch, pull games off. Impressive, but I want them to be more impressive as we're talking about them in the top 10. I want them to be more impressive to me. Close those games out earlier. Don't get me all scared for them. I think they should be ahead of Oklahoma. And you got people saying, well, Oklahoma's going to beat Baylor this week. You'll see. Yeah, we're going to see who I'm picking in a separate video on that game. But these aren't predictions, and college football playoff polls shouldn't be predictions. The AP poll shouldn't be predictions. They pretty much played the same schedule on top of Baylor beating Oklahoma State, on top of Baylor beating Kansas State. Oklahoma lost to Kansas State. Baylor should be ranked ahead of them right now. There's really no reason for Oklahoma to be ahead of Baylor, especially because the game is coming up. Let that game kind of decide. The body of work right now should decide who's ranked ahead of who. And then we have that Pac-12 battle at 8 and then going down to 7. I'll reveal both. Pretty much everyone has Oregon over Utah. I'm not really going to argue that. I have Utah ahead because multiple things. I think they execute a little better. I think they're more, they're well coached. They're executing on both sides of the ball. Their loss to USC, I keep bringing it up, and I kind of factored this in a little bit. Zach Moss, who's Utah's best player, one more electrifying, backs in football, players in football. He got hurt early in that game. He got beat up, and Huntley, their quarterback, actually got beat up in that game. Continued to play through it. But I kind of factor that in, and they almost came back and won the game too. I kind of factor that in a little bit. I'm not considering them undefeated because of that by any means, but I factor that in. And Oregon, extremely talented team. So that's a battle there. I hope those two teams win out so we see a great Pac-12 championship game. And both those teams, if they remain undefeated going into that game, that win will mean a lot. It would have a lot of value. So the winner of that game can definitely make the playoff, in my opinion. And in my opinion, they will be considered for the playoff. I think Oregon will be considered more for the college ball playoff if they win out because their only loss was the first game of the year. So that would mean they're on a huge streak. Their loss would be to an SEC team, a good SEC team in Auburn, Utah's and USC. Well, how much would they factor in the injuries? Doesn't seem like they're factoring in a whole bunch, but Utah's a pretty darn good team. And then for the top 6 here, something a little different we're doing here. So I put it in the bracket form, just like we see in the college football playoff show. That is my top 6. And people may have a problem with Minnesota at 4, but the way I think of it is, say the season ended today, right now, right as it sits, who deserves to be in the top 4? Those are the teams that deserve to be in the top 4. And that's not how it works, but at the same time, it's not predictions. I think people predict too much when making rankings. Minnesota got screwed over with the 17th rank, but they made a valid point that they haven't really beat anybody, even if with that, applied as a valid argument, I still don't agree with 17, but they kind of contradicted themselves, like going up closer to the top of the rankings last week. We'll see what they got this week. But Penn State had 2 pretty good wins, and then Penn State was number 4. Minnesota beat Penn State. So if Minnesota beats Iowa this next week, they have a better resume than Penn State had at 4. But I don't think they'll put them at 4 if they beat Iowa next week. But right now, being undefeated and have a big-time win, that's why they're at 4. But kind of to backtrack here, I still got Georgia at 6. That South Carolina loss hurts still. I think Georgia's getting better, and that's why I have them. It's a tough call with the Pac-12 teams because the Pac-12 teams I'm very impressed with. To me, they don't have a bad loss. I don't really, again, what I explained about Utah, losing to USC with the injuries, it's not as bad as a loss as you might think. So Georgia has a worse loss than them, but a lot better, body of work in terms of consistently who they play, and they're getting better, and it's clear they're getting better, very, very clear. And people kind of ruling them out in that SEC title. If they make it there, they actually have a tougher schedule than Florida for that East, kind of making that SEC title. Georgia definitely has a shot. My pick right now would definitely be LSU if that's who they would play. But Georgia comes in at 6 after it's tight between those Pac-12 teams. But then there's a clear 5 for me. Alabama is at 5. They're coming off a loss. These rankings change every week based on what these teams do. They're coming off a loss. I dropped them in the 5. Yeah, they beat my number 1 team. LSU's been my number 1 team. You look at the score line, it was a little more disappointing than what the score line will show, actually. LSU straight out beat them. So that kind of factors into that. Up to Minnesota, they're undefeated. It is so hard to go undefeated, and they just beat who they had ranked 4. I had ranked 5. It's impressive. It was an impressive win, too. They have to be 4 right now. 3 is Clemson. They're in the same area as Minnesota. Not the most impressive schedule. Yeah, Minnesota has that win over Penn State, so you can kind of give the edge to Minnesota there. But when it's that close, I'm able to make the decision that Clemson, I think, is a much better team than Minnesota. So I have to put Clemson at number 3. That is a close one, though. And then Ohio State 2, LSU 1. Ohio State's body of work compared to LSU's body of work, it's not close. When it's close, then you can get that tiebreaker. Who is better, and that would be a good debate there. But LSU's schedule, their body work, their resume is just so much better, and it was better before this Alabama game. I was mind blown that Ohio State was number 1. You match up the resume, you match up the schedule, who they beat. LSU it was way better. Ohio State's super impressive. They're very, very, very capable of winning the national championship this year, and that's why they're my number 2 team. But LSU, dominant team, great body work. They're my number 1. And they have the Heisman leader right now. So that's what it would look like for me right now. Obviously, Minnesota has some good games to play. Ohio State's got some good games to play. And then if they get through that, they will meet up in the Big Ten Championship, which would ultimately boot one of those teams out. The favorite in that game right now, obviously, would be Ohio State, so that would boot Minnesota out. And then who do you put in? Do you put Bama if they win out? And if Georgia beats LSU, it's a big old mess. It is a big old mess. Or if it's Florida that beats LSU, Florida a little less likely. It'll be a mess because they have 2 losses. But if Georgia beats LSU, we have a 3-way tie in the SEC, all 1 loss. Georgia would have to be in because they beat the number 1 team. They had a loss, only 1 loss, and they would be, kind of hot at that point and won the SEC title. Then between LSU and Bama, I think it boots Bama out if that's the case. I think LSU would stay in, probably at the 4 seed. I just don't see. If Ohio State's I say the loser of the Big Ten championship, I think would be out. The Pac-12 team would have to be, if Utah and Oregon both win out, the winner of that game would have to be strongly considered. I think if everything goes to plan, if LSU wins out, Ohio State wins out, Clemson's very likely to win out. They win out, and then we get, I would say, Oregon over Utah. I think they put Oregon in over Alabama because they lost week 1 and they went on. It would be a 12-game winning streak with some quality wins in there. If it was Utah, I think they would put Alabama in over because I think they're kind of factoring in that Oregon lost week 1 and they played Auburn. Utah really doesn't have that. They lost to USC kind of middle of the road, which people are overlooking the fact about the injuries like I mentioned. But that's kind of my prediction, me predicting what the college football playoff, what's in their mind really. But let's just say this was the scenario right here. LSU would play Minnesota in the first round. It'd be a pretty big win for LSU. Clemson, Ohio State would be a heck of a game. I think people continue to underrate Clemson's defense, and their offense will get better. They did the same thing last year. They had close games in the ACC. One year it's Syracuse they're close with. Next year it's somebody else. Pittsburgh, whatever it may be, and then they just lights out in the college football playoff. It happens every year. It's just hard not to pick Ohio State in this game as we sit. I think they have the ability to be playmakers on defense, especially if Chase Young's playing, and Justin Fields. Even though Clemson has a very good defense, Justin Fields will make that extra play. So I would pick Ohio State in that game, but that would be just a great ball game. And Ohio State LSU, I think, will be a very high-scoring game. It would have to go with Joe Burrow at this point, but that would be an exciting game. But what would it be like if Joe Burrow was great under pressure against Alabama, and they got some big-time defense players, but what would it be like if he had Chase Young coming after him, Chase Young to finish the play? Joe Burrow escaped a lot of sacks, broke a lot of sacks, and made big plays on those. If Alabama would have made those sacks or those hits, it would have been a different game. Chase Young doesn't miss those, so that would be the edge for Ohio State. It would be very hard for me to pick against LSU, though, with all the talent that they have, not that Ohio State doesn't. So I guess my pick right now would be LSU, but as you can see, we have endless amounts of scenarios, interesting ones, and we would have some damn good football games in the playoff. I just wish it was 8 teams. That would be great, but there would probably be more chaos then. Actually, I don't know, because I think it's more chaos if you're trying to squeeze in 4 teams, and it's a hard job to do. So then kind of going back and looking at my full top 25 again, the teams that just missed: Virginia Tech, Iowa, Oklahoma State, Appalachian State, Louisiana Tech dropped out, Iowa, Wake Forest, San Diego State, and that is my top 25 heading into Week 12. We do this video every single week. We got college football pick'ems for Week 12 coming up a little bit after this video every single Monday, and then NFL power rankings, predictions, recaps all week. We got you covered, so hopefully you can join us for all that. Hopefully you can subscribe. 40K, that's our subscriber goal by the end of the year. Please help us out by subscribing. But that's going to do it for this one. Thanks, everyone, for watching. Goodbye.